Hey there, drowsy historian here. Tonight we're heading back to ancient Rome, an empire that conquered most of the known world, built architectural wonders, and somehow still thought fish gut sauce belonged on dessert. Whether you were rich or poor, soldier or senator, Roman food wasn't about satisfaction. It was about surviving one suspicious mouthful at a time. Before we start this dive into Roman cuisine, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy these soothing journeys into historical disappointment. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fun seeing who's falling asleep to historical facts at 2 a.m. Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and prepare to explore the glory of Rome. One overcooked vegetable, half-rotten fig, and fermented anchovy drizzle at a time. So, you found yourself in ancient Rome. Maybe you expected marble columns, noble speeches, or gladiators flexing in the sun. Maybe you were picturing togas and triumphs, or philosophers discussing the meaning of life while sipping wine under olive trees. But what you probably weren't prepared for was the food, and how much it would make you long for the taste of cardboard. Because Rome may have built roads, conquered nations, and invented indoor plumbing, but when it came to meals, Rome kind of sucked. Roman food wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about satisfaction. In fact, depending on who you were, rich, poor, free, enslaved, it might not have even been about survival. If you were lucky, your meal would be bland. If you weren't, it would be spoiled, sketchy, or simply not there at all. Forget the romantic images of opulent feasts and roasted boars. Most people weren't reclining at golden tables, being hand-fed grapes. Most people were chewing dry bread in a smoky tenement, hoping not to crack a tooth. Let's start with the basics. The Roman day was divided into 3 meals: ientaculum, prandium, and cena. You can think of them as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but don't expect them to match modern versions. Ientaculum, the so-called breakfast, was usually a handful of cold leftovers, maybe bread, a few olives, and a splash of watered-down wine. There were no eggs, no bacon, and certainly no coffee. If you were poor, it was whatever scraps you had on hand. If you were rich, you probably skipped it altogether, because eating before noon was considered a bit vulgar. Then came prandium, the midday meal. For the lower classes, this was often eaten quickly on the job or grabbed from a local food stall. We'll get to those soon. It might consist of porridge, fruit, a bit of cheese, or a sad-looking sausage. Again, if you had means, you might enjoy some meat or pastries. But most people? Most people got whatever was cheap, hot, and questionably edible. There wasn't much celebration involved, just enough food to keep you upright. Finally, there was cena, the main event. This was the evening meal, and in theory, it's where Romans pulled out the stops. For the wealthy, cena was a status symbol. Multiple courses, exotic ingredients, and a lot of deeply unnecessary animal parts. If you were one of the elites, this is where you'd impress your guests with sheer volume and spectacle. Not flavour, not nutrition, just pure uncut opulence. The poor had a different experience. Their cena was often just more porridge, more bread, maybe some vegetables boiled beyond recognition. The only constant was disappointment. And if you couldn't cook, you'd turn to the thermopolium. These were street food stalls, essentially ancient Roman fast food joints. If you lived in a cramped insula, a cheap apartment building with poor ventilation, high fire risk, and walls thinner than political promises, you probably didn't have a kitchen. So you'd head downstairs and buy your dinner from a guy ladling mystery stew out of a bubbling clay vat. These stalls were loud, hot, and smelled like a combination of grease, ash, and regret. But they were cheap, fast, and, if you didn't die from it, filling. Now, if you were wealthy, your experience was a little different. You lived in a domus, a private home with a dedicated kitchen, servants, and space to store ingredients that didn't come with flies baked in. You had access to spices imported from across the empire, cooks who knew at least one method besides boiling, and the free time to pretend that cow's udder stuffed with fish was a delicacy. But wealth didn't mean good taste. It just meant variety. And in Rome, variety often meant flamingo tongues, fermented fish sauce, and recipes that only made sense if you were trying to impress someone while actively hating food. This disconnect between abundance and enjoyment defined Roman dining. Food wasn't primarily about pleasure or nutrition. It was about hierarchy. Who got what, when, and how. The poor got sustenance, if that. The rich got decadence with a side of gout. And everyone else tried to avoid food poisoning long enough to see tomorrow's stale loaf. It's worth noting that Roman cuisine wasn't universally awful. There were moments of brilliance: herbs, cheeses, baked goods, and regional specialties from across the empire. But the core diet, especially for the average citizen, was repetitive, undercooked, and aggressively bland. Romans liked their food salty, sour, and preserved within an inch of its life. Sugar was practically unknown. Butter was for barbarians. And freshness was more of a suggestion than a standard. So whether you were gnawing crusty bread in your insula or vomiting mid-banquet in your domus, one truth united all Romans: food wasn't something to enjoy, it was something to endure. If you were poor in ancient Rome, and let's be honest, most people were, your diet wasn't built around variety or comfort or even taste. It was built around survival. You ate to stay upright, to avoid fainting in the sun, to drag yourself through another day of hauling bricks, scrubbing laundry, or sweeping temple floors for someone wealthier than you'll ever be. You didn't look forward to meals. You tolerated them. Sometimes you feared them, but you never celebrated them. Your staples were humble, coarse, and often hard to digest, and that was on a good day. The cornerstone of your diet was bread. Not the fluffy golden kind you might imagine pulled from some rustic oven in Tuscany. No, this was barley bread, the cheap, dense, stone-filled cousin of real food. The flour was poorly milled, often mixed with ash, sand, or ground bits of grain husk. Occasionally, it contained small pebbles, not by design but as a byproduct of inefficient hand grinding using quernstones. You didn't need toppings because bread already came with a risk of dental trauma. Then there was pulse, a watery porridge made from boiled grains like spelt, barley, or emmer. If that sounds uninspiring, it's because it was. Imagine oatmeal, but without cream, sugar, or hope. Most of the time, it was just grains and water, maybe a pinch of salt if you were lucky, and maybe a few wilted herbs if someone had a garden nearby. Pulse wasn't meant to excite your palate. It was meant to fill your gut and keep you from collapsing. You'd slurp it down in silence, then move on. For protein, you turned to legumes, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans. These were cheap and easy to store, which made them perfect for poor households. You might mash them into a paste or boil them into a soup. Either way, they were bland, mushy, and heavily associated with poverty. The ancient Roman upper class viewed beans as lowly food, a peasant staple, a soldier's ration, an embarrassment on any real dinner table. But for you, they were necessary, affordable, and dependable. You didn't ask for more. You just chewed and hoped your body could handle the consequences. Vegetables were another dietary lifeline, though vegetables might be overstating it. You ate what was cheap, abundant, and in season, usually cabbage, onions, leeks, or beets, boiled into submission. Raw vegetables were rare. Cooking everything was a matter of necessity, both to make it edible and to reduce the risk of disease. Unfortunately, cooking in a poor Roman home was no easy task. If you lived in an insula, your tiny, fire-prone apartment probably didn't even have a kitchen. You might share a communal hearth with your neighbours or cook on a small brazier. Most nights, though, it was easier and less smoky to buy your meal from a food stall. For flavour, there wasn't much to work with. Salt was precious. Spices were expensive imports, You could use vinegar, if you had some, or maybe a splash of garum, fermented fish sauce, if you were feeling brave and wanted to risk blowing your week's budget on a condiment that smelled like death in a jar. More commonly, you'd drink posca, a mixture of vinegar and water, possibly with herbs. This was the hydration method of choice for soldiers and labourers, partly because it was safer than straight water, and partly because it masked the flavour of questionable sauces. It wasn't delicious, but it was cheap, mildly antiseptic, and hard to mess up. Unless you drank too much, in which case you'd find out just how acidic vinegar could be on an empty stomach. Meat was a rarity. You didn't buy it, you waited for it. Occasionally, during a public festival or religious sacrifice, the leftovers might be distributed to the crowd. A few scraps of goat, or some sinewy beef that had been sitting in the sun just a little too long. More often, you'd settle for salted fish, if the market had some left that wasn't already rotting. When desperation hit, you turned to whatever you could find. Small birds, snails, street scraps. You didn't ask questions. If it looked like it used to move, you cooked it. Or at least tried to. This was not a diet of decadence. It was a diet of necessity. Repetitive, exhausting, and nutritionally questionable. You rarely felt full, and when you did, it was usually the bloat of pulses sitting too heavily in your gut. Malnutrition was common. So were intestinal parasites, and yet you kept eating. Because there was no alternative. You ate what you could get when you could get it. You chewed each bite like it owed you money. You drank your posca with the enthusiasm of someone who knew what happened when you didn't. There were moments, of course, a fresh fig in summer, a crust of bread still warm from the oven, a handful of nuts on a feast day, when food felt like something more than punishment. But those moments were rare and fleeting, and almost always out of reach. For most Romans living on the margins, food was less a source of joy, and more a daily negotiation with hunger, one that didn't always end in your favour. If you were rich in ancient Rome, food was no longer just about survival, but that didn't mean it was about enjoyment either. It was about performance, status, spectacle. You didn't eat to nourish yourself. You ate to remind everyone around you that you could afford to be deeply, gloriously, and almost proudly tasteless. And not in the modern sense of poor manners. In the literal sense, you made choices that actively offended your tongue, because restraint was for peasants. A proper elite Roman dinner, your cena, wasn't just a meal. It was an event. Courses could stretch into the double digits. Tables groaned with variety, not because anyone needed that much food, but because they needed their guests to see it. Your goal wasn't to fill stomachs. Your goal was to fill the room with envy. That meant rare ingredients, elaborate preparations, and dishes designed more for conversation than consumption. Take dormice, for example. Not a euphemism, actual mice. Romans considered them a delicacy, not sewer rats or scrappy vermin, but specially bred fattened dormice raised for the table. They'd be stuffed with minced meat, herbs, or even nuts and honey, then roasted or boiled. Picture something the size of a chubby hamster, presented like a prize. And yes, people ate them with enthusiasm, not because they tasted good, but because they were expensive and hard to find. That was the point. And then there were flamingo tongues. Bright pink birds weren't eaten whole. That would be crude. Instead, just the tongues were harvested, cooked with rare spices, and served in silver dishes. According to some sources, they were rubbery and unpleasant, but nobody seemed to care. If you could afford a dish of 20 flamingo tongues, you weren't trying to impress with flavour. You were trying to make someone at the table feel poor. The same logic applied to things like jellyfish, boiled sow's womb, and cow udders. The famous Roman cookbook, attributed to Apicius, a wealthy first-century gourmand, includes recipes for all of these. Apicius himself is something of a culinary legend in Rome, the man who, according to rumour, killed himself when he found out he only had a few million sesterces left and couldn't maintain his lavish food habits. His cookbook, isn't so much a guide to delicious meals as it is a catalogue of what happens when wealth meets a complete lack of restraint. Everything, and this cannot be stressed enough, was drenched in garum. If you weren't drowning your food in fermented fish guts, were you even Roman? Garum was the universal condiment of the empire, made by layering fish innards and salt in a jar and letting it sit in the sun until it turned into a viscous, salty liquid. Garum was poured on meat, vegetables, fruit, even desserts. The rich could afford the fancy versions, like garum sociorum, aged and filtered for smoothness. The poor got the sludge at the bottom of the barrel. Either way, your food never stopped smelling like low tide. A typical elite feast might start with an appetizer of pickled vegetables, oysters, and honey-coated dates. Then came the main courses, multiple rounds of meat and fish, often disguised to look like something else. Romans loved surprise food. A pig might be roasted with sausages stuffed into its belly, so that when carved, it appeared to give birth to other meats. A pastry might look like a bird, but contain fish. It was culinary theatre, and you were both performer and audience. The rich didn't eat like this every day. Even they had limits, but when they did it hard. Slaves would circulate with bowls of warm water for hand washing between courses. Musicians might play while guests reclined on couches, leaning on their elbows, half drunk on mulsum, a mix of wine and honey, and trying to remember which dish was the stuffed sea urchin and which was the spiced dormouse. Portions were small, but courses were endless. And if you wanted to keep eating without exploding, there were options. Yes, Romans did sometimes make themselves vomit during long meals, not in some sinister vomitorium chamber, which is a myth, but quietly in nearby buckets or back rooms, so they could free up space for more. Again, not because the food was delicious, but because quitting early made it look like you couldn't handle the lifestyle. And after all that effort, the rare ingredients, the endless preparation, the 12-course absurdity, you'd likely go home, bloated, hungover, and still vaguely hungry for something that didn't taste like fish sauce or status anxiety. So yes, if you were rich in ancient Rome, you could eat flamingo tongues and honey-roasted mice, served on silver plates, in rooms filled with music and incense. But did it taste good? Not really. Did it make you feel full? Not in any satisfying way, but it let you pretend you were more civilized than the people you'd conquered, even as you gnawed thoughtfully on a boiled cow's udder, wondering if this was what victory tasted like. If there was one thing you could count on in ancient Rome, whether you were rich, poor, enslaved, or marching in the legions, it was bread. Bread was the great equalizer. It crossed class boundaries, filled bellies, and formed the nutritional backbone of the Roman diet. But just because everyone ate it didn't mean everyone enjoyed it. In fact, depending on your social status, bread could be a simple comfort or a calculated dental hazard. Let's say you were poor, a plebeian or labourer. Your daily bread was panis plebeius, a rough dark loaf made from barley or low-quality wheat. It was often coarse, dense, and baked with more ambition than precision. The flour used to make it was milled by hand using querns, circular stone grinders that pulverized grain with all the delicacy of a landslide. Unfortunately, the grinding process didn't just crush the grain, it also shaved off bits of stone from the quern itself, which meant your flour came with an added bonus: grit. Not metaphorical grit, mind you, literal, tooth-chipping grit. This meant your bread was often full of sand-like particles or tiny rock fragments. Eating it wasn't just unpleasant, it was physically dangerous. You chew slowly, cautiously, always aware that the next bite might send you running to the nearest blacksmith for emergency dental work. Bread wasn't soft, fluffy, or aromatic. It was dense, dry, and potentially weaponized. A loaf left out too long could double as a building material. Some loaves were even discovered fossilized in Pompeii, perfectly preserved by volcanic ash. based on how they looked, the eruption might not have been the worst thing to happen to them. To stretch flour further, bakers, or those grinding grain at home, sometimes added filler materials. One of the most common was ash, scraped from the hearth or burned plant matter. Ash acted as a bulking agent and sometimes even a flavouring, though that depended on your definition of flavour. At best, it gave your bread a smoky undertone. At worst, it tasted like someone had rolled your meal in fireplace dust and decided not to mention it. Other additives included chopped straw, bran husks, or whatever else could be ground fine enough to pass as flour. The goal wasn't taste or nutrition. The goal was volume. For the wealthier classes, bread was a very different experience. If you were fortunate enough to afford it, you might enjoy panis siligineus, a fine white bread made from highly sifted wheat flour. It was softer, lighter, and considered more refined. This type of bread was baked in private villas or purchased from specialised bakeries. It had none of the grit, ash, or questionable grey colour of plebeian loaves. It was smooth, pale, and, more importantly, easy on the teeth. But even then, it wasn't fresh in the modern sense. Romans lacked preservatives, and bread staled quickly. You ate it while it was good, and after that, you soaked it in wine, oil, or water to make it chewable again. Baking itself wasn't always done at home, especially among the poor. Most people didn't own ovens. If you lived in a cramped insula, you certainly didn't have space or permission to build a fire big enough to bake. Instead, you brought your dough to a communal bakery or bought loaves from street vendors or market stalls. These bakeries produced hundreds of loaves at once, and quality control was a fantasy. Bread was often baked in round moulds or free-formed and marked with identifying stamps so people could reclaim their dough after it had been fired in a public oven. Mistaken loaves, of course, were just a part of the process. Roman soldiers also relied heavily on bread, often in the form of hardtack, dry, shelf-stable loaves that could last for weeks, if not months. They were difficult to chew, often soaked in water or wine before eating, and universally despised, but they were easy to transport and didn't spoil as quickly as other foods, which made them ideal for military campaigns and long marches. Flavour was not part of the design brief. Function came first. Despite its flaws, bread was so central to Roman life that riots would erupt when supplies ran short. The government eventually instituted the annona, a state-sponsored grain dole that distributed free or subsidised grain to urban citizens. The goal was simple: keep people fed enough not to revolt. From that grain, bread was made, or attempted. Whether it was baked at home, purchased from a thermopolium, or handed out in rations, bread remained the anchor of the Roman table. But no matter how central it was, or how often it appeared, Roman bread rarely delighted. It sustained. It filled. It scraped its way down your throat and clung to your insides like a reminder that life was more about enduring than enjoying. Whether it was panis plebeius, full of gravel and guilt, or panis siligineus, soft and socially acceptable, it did its job. Just don't expect it to smile while doing it. If ancient Rome had a national flavour, it was rot. Not metaphorical rot, real pungent, nose-wilting decay. And that rot had a name: garum. Whether you were a noble sipping imported wine, or a labourer chewing yesterday's bread, chances are your food was drowned in this fermented fish sauce. Garum was the universal condiment of the Roman world. Sharp, salty, and unapologetically horrific. It didn't matter what you were eating. If it didn't have garum on it, it wasn't finished. Garum was made by taking small fish, anchovies, mackerel, sardines, or whatever swam a little too slowly that day, and mixing them with salt and their own guts. This mixture was then packed into vats or jars and left out in the sun for weeks, sometimes months, not covered, not refrigerated, just open-air fermentation under the Roman sun, turning fish into a sludgy, liquefied mess. The enzymes from the viscera did all the work, breaking everything down until it was no longer recognizable as anything that once swam. The resulting liquid, once strained, was garum, and it was worth its weight in gold, or at least in salt. If that sounds revolting, it's because it was, but Romans adored it. They poured garum on everything: roasted meats, vegetable stews, boiled lentils, even desserts, all received generous helpings of this oily, brownish liquid. They believed it enhanced flavour, improved digestion, and added a certain refinement to even the humblest dishes. For them, the smell wasn't a warning. It was a reassurance that the meal had some backbone. For you, it would probably trigger an immediate gag reflex and a quiet prayer to be reincarnated somewhere with garlic butter. Garum had many names and many grades. A closely related product was called liquamen, which some historians think was either a weaker version or simply a regional synonym. The terminology varies depending on the source and the time period, but both terms referred to the same essential horror: fish that had been turned into sauce by way of decomposition. There was also alec, the chunky sludge left at the bottom of the fermentation vat. The rich wouldn't touch it, but it was cheap and available, so the poor made do. That was Rome in a nutshell. The rich got the top layer, the poor got the leftovers, and the rest depended on how brave your stomach was feeling that day. Of course, not all garum was created equal. There were luxury versions, like garum sociorum, a highly refined export product from Baetica in modern-day Spain. This type of garum was made with care, or at least more care than the street stuff. It was strained, filtered, and aged just enough to qualify as upscale rot. Wealthy Romans imported it by the amphora, large ceramic storage jars used for transporting wine, oil, and sauces across the empire. Garum sociorum came stamped with seals of authenticity and was shipped with the same reverence modern collectors give to fine wine. The lower quality stuff, by contrast, was closer to edible trauma. Made in bulk, using whatever fish were cheap and whatever workers could tolerate the smell, this garum was less about subtlety and more about masking the taste of whatever unfortunate ingredient it was poured over. Spoiled meat? Add garum. Watery stew? Add garum. Bread too dry? Garum. Possibly poisoned? Still garum. It was culinary duct tape, a one-size-fits-all solution to every Roman kitchen emergency. Production centres for garum dotted the coasts of the empire, especially in areas where the smell wouldn't upset too many sensitive citizens, which is to say, anywhere downwind of polite society. The facilities reeked for miles. If you lived nearby, you stopped noticing eventually. Or you moved. Workers in these factories endured some of the worst conditions imaginable, stirring vats of fish rot under the blazing sun, splashing fermented goo into amphorae, and walking around permanently coated in the scent of marine decay. They didn't write poems about it. They just did the work and hoped not to fall in. Despite all of this, garum was a commercial success. It was exported across the empire, traded in markets, and served at both elite feasts and common meals. Roman cookbooks like the one attributed to Apicius called for garum in nearly every recipe. It was, quite literally, the taste of Rome. And Romans loved it enough to put it on things that absolutely should not have had fish sauce anywhere near them. Sweet desserts with honey and garum, fruit compotes with garum, wine with garum. At a certain point, you have to wonder if they were trying to prove a point, or if their taste buds simply surrendered. And if you think this is just ancient exaggeration, that maybe it wasn't so bad, consider this. Archaeologists have recovered ancient garum residue from amphora and attempted to recreate it based on ancient recipes. The results? By every modern account, it smells like death and tastes like salt mixed with anchovy-flavoured despair, which means they probably got it right. So yes, if you were a Roman, rich or poor, garum was unavoidable. It was the Empire's favourite flavour, their signature smell, and possibly their greatest culinary sin. You didn't have to like it, you just had to live with it. And if you couldn't stomach that, well, good luck eating anything else. If bread was the backbone of the Roman diet, then pulse was the mushy, underwhelming glue that held everything else together. Pulse was not glamorous. It was not inventive. It was not even particularly edible some days, but it was everywhere. A boiled mixture of grain and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt or a hint of oil. Pulse was Rome's catch-all solution to the question, what can we cook with almost nothing and eat with even less enthusiasm? Everyone ate pulse, from beggars on street corners to soldiers in far-flung garrisons, from overworked servants to cautious aristocrats nursing their digestion. Pulse was one of the few foods that truly cut across class lines. Not because it was beloved, but because it was reliable. It didn't spoil easily. It didn't require complicated preparation, and it could be made in massive quantities for next to nothing. When in doubt, boil some grain. When bored of everything else, boil some grain. When you can't afford meat or vegetables or flavour, boil some grain. The base ingredient for pulse varied, but it usually came from one of Rome's holy trinity of grains: spelt, barley, and emmer. Spelt was the most common among plebeians, a hardy, coarse grain that could be ground into meal or boiled whole. Barley was cheaper still, often reserved for animal fodder or the truly desperate. It was nutritious technically, but deeply unpleasant to chew. It had a bitter edge and a rubbery texture that even a long boil couldn't entirely kill. Emmer, a type of ancient wheat, was considered more refined and could be found in the kitchens of wealthier Romans, though even they weren't particularly thrilled about it unless it came buried under honey, cheese, or a generous spoonful of imported garum. To make pulse, you simply boiled the grain in water until it broke down into a thick, sticky mass. If you were lucky, it had a porridge-like consistency. If you weren't, it came out resembling paste, or worse, congealed slurry with the consistency of wet clay. Either way, you'd scoop it up with your hands or a bit of bread, blow on the steam if it was too hot, and eat it as quickly as you could to minimise the experience. And you would repeat this process a lot. For some, pulse was a twice daily staple. If your resources were tight or your job exhausting, this was what sustained you. It filled your stomach and kept you upright. You didn't look forward to it, but you didn't complain either. Complaining took energy, and you needed that energy to chew. Roman soldiers, who were expected to carry their own rations and cook for themselves, relied heavily on pulse. Out on campaign, it was often their only meal, supplemented by whatever scraps or wild greens they could find along the road. In many ways, it was the perfect military food, compact, storable, and barely perishable. It provided fuel, if not morale. Historians have even noted that Roman commanders encouraged a simple diet like this to harden the troops and distinguish them from the soft, overfed enemy. In reality, it mostly just distinguished the soldiers from people with working taste buds. Even among the elite, pulse had its moments. Wealthy Romans, especially those with a fondness for rustic virtue or performative simplicity, occasionally indulged in a peasant's meal of boiled grain. Of course, their version didn't come plain. It was dressed with herbs, sweetened with dates or honey, or layered with soft cheese. It was pulse in the way a designer burlap sack is still a luxury good, meant to signal simplicity, not endure it. For them, pulse was a novelty. For everyone else, it was breakfast, lunch, and possibly dinner. There were variations, of course. Some added lentils or chickpeas to bulk it out. Others mixed in bits of old meat or chopped greens if they had access to a garden or a forgiving neighbour. In coastal areas, dried fish might be shredded and stirred in, which added protein and the gentle ambience of death. But even with additions, the base remained the same. boiled grain, and water. No matter how many times you tried to improve it, it always circled back to the same bland, heavy, greyish mass you'd been eating since childhood. Pools wasn't just a dish, it was an inevitability. You could ignore it for a day, maybe two, if your coin purse allowed for something better. But eventually, you returned. Because it was cheap, because it was filling, and because it was Roman. In fact, the word pools came to symbolise the foundation of Roman eating habits. Simple, functional, and stubbornly unlovable. And yet, for all its mediocrity, pools had staying power. Long after more elaborate dishes came and went, long after garum fell out of favour and flamingo tongues became a historical punchline, pools kept bubbling in pots across the empire. It fed the workers, the soldiers, the enslaved, the sick, and the stubbornly nostalgic. It didn't taste good. It didn't need to. It just needed to work. And work it did, every miserable bite. If you were a typical Roman, poor, overworked, and underfed, meat wasn't part of your daily routine. It wasn't even part of your weekly routine. Meat was a special occasion, a rare indulgence, or a charitable handout you prayed for more than tasted. Most days, your meals came from fields and grain stores, not butcher shops. And even when meat did appear on your plate, it was often stringy, gristly, oversalted, or suspiciously unidentifiable. You didn't ask questions, you didn't get options. You just chewed cautiously and hoped it wasn't something's foot. For most Romans, eating meat meant one of two things had happened. Either you were lucky enough to attend a religious festival where animals were sacrificed and the leftovers distributed to the public, or you had enough coin to buy a scrap of something vaguely animal-shaped from a market vendor or street cook. In both cases, you weren't getting prime cuts. You were getting what was left, the offal, the cartilage, the chewy bits with more personality than protein. Sacrificial meat was a surprisingly important part of the Roman food supply, not because it was frequent, but because it was one of the few ways poor people could access fresh meat at all. In these public religious ceremonies, a bull, sheep, or pig would be slaughtered in honour of a god, and while the choicest parts were burned on the altar, the rest was cooked, divided, and handed out. If you were in the right place at the right time, you might walk away with a bone, a hunk of shoulder, or, if the gods were really smiling, a scrap of liver. You'd take it home, boil it into a broth, and pretend it wasn't half gristle. Compared to your usual diet, it was divine. In the markets, meat was available, but not reliably affordable. What you'd find depended on where you lived and how desperate the butchers were. Poultry was more common than beef or lamb. Chickens, geese, doves. Pigs were valued, but also expensive. And wild game? That was mostly for the upper crust. What you could usually afford was salted meat, cured and dried to survive the climate and long trade routes. Unfortunately, the preservation process often turned meat into something more like jerky soaked in brine for 3 weeks, and then left to re-dry in disappointment. If you managed to get your hands on fresh meat, you might grind it up with herbs and make offa, a kind of meatball that could be fried or boiled. It was one of the more practical ways to stretch what little meat you had, mixing it with breadcrumbs or grain to create something that resembled food. Offa was popular among all classes, though the ingredients changed dramatically depending on your social standing. The rich might add exotic spices or fine cheeses. You added crumbs, a few sprigs of something green, and whatever meat was least likely to be still moving. Another common form was lucanica, a spicy sausage supposedly originating from the region of Lucania in southern Italy. These sausages were made of ground pork, heavily seasoned, and often sold cooked and hot from stalls. Lucanica was a street food favourite, relatively affordable compared to whole cuts and a good way to get protein without fully bankrupting yourself. That said, quality varied. Some were rich and flavourful, others were mostly fat and filler, with the spice doing a heroic job of covering up what might have once been feet. For the wealthy, meat was a different experience, though not necessarily a better one. They had access to choice cuts, exotic animals, and imported delicacies. Roasted peacocks, stuffed boar heads, whole lambs with fish sewn inside. If it was dead and could be cooked, a rich Roman had probably tried it, possibly twice. But taste wasn't the point. Presentation was. The goal was to impress dinner guests with something grotesque and elaborate, not something tender and well-seasoned. Often the most expensive meats were the worst to eat, and even the wealthy quietly longed for something simpler, while chewing on jellyfish with a polite grimace. Still, the ability to serve meat at your table, especially red meat, was a sign of power. Romans associated meat with strength, masculinity, and status. Soldiers were sometimes given meat rations to keep up their energy and morale, while gladiators, interestingly, mostly subsisted on a high-carb, mostly vegetarian diet. They were even nicknamed hordearii, or barley men, because they ate so much grain. Apparently, meat wasn't as essential to toughness as people like to believe. In the end, meat was rare, uneven, and often unpleasant, unless you were rich, and then it was expensive, excessive, and still unpleasant. Whether you ate it salted, sacrificed, stuffed in sausage, or fried into an offer, one thing remained true. You didn't eat it often, and when you did, it probably wasn't worth the wait. But it was still better than another bowl of lukewarm poles, which meant you ate it with gratitude anyway, right after checking it for feathers, hooves, or teeth. If you were a Roman looking for comfort food, dairy was not where you found it. In fact, it was probably where your hope went to die. Because while dairy products did exist in ancient Rome, and were even eaten fairly widely, they were not what you'd call satisfying. They were functional. They filled gaps in the diet. They kept children from starving and added a bit of fat to otherwise joyless meals. But if you were hoping for creamy, dreamy indulgence, you were about 2 millennia early. Let's start with cheese, or what passed for cheese in Rome. Known as Caseus, Roman cheese came in many forms, but the most common was a sour, crumbly curd made from sheep's or goat's milk. Cow's milk cheese was rarer and more expensive. You didn't slice it, you scraped it. It didn't melt over dishes like modern cheese. It clung to your teeth and smelled like something that had lost a bet with the sun. Fresh cheese was soft and tangy. Aged cheese was hard and brittle, sometimes used more as seasoning than food. If you had a grater, you'd sprinkle it over bread or porridge like a garnish. If you didn't, you just gnawed on it like a determined mouse. That said, cheese was probably the most successful Roman dairy product, not because it was beloved, but because it had shelf life. In a world without refrigeration, anything that didn't spoil in a matter of hours was considered a culinary miracle. Cheese could be smoked, salted, or left to age in cool storage areas. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Poor families often made their own from leftover milk, and soldiers carried hard cheese as part of their rations. It travelled well, held up in heat, and had just enough fat and protein to make it feel like food. Milk, however, was a different story. It spoiled quickly, often within a day, especially in the Mediterranean climate, and there wasn't much you could do about it. Romans didn't have pasteurization. They didn't have cool cellars in every neighbourhood, and they certainly didn't have ice boxes or sealed containers. If you bought fresh milk in the morning, you needed to drink it before noon or risk developing a close, personal relationship with your toilet. For children, the sick or the elderly, milk might be consumed warm and fresh. But for most adults, it was seen as a risky beverage, the kind of thing you only drank if there were no better options. Spoiled milk was sometimes curdled into cheese or mixed with vinegar to make something vaguely resembling yogurt, though calling it that would be generous. Then there was butter, and here things got awkward. Romans did know about butter, and they certainly knew how to make it, but they didn't like it. In fact, they saw it as foreign, crude, and frankly, a little gross. Butter was associated with the Gauls and Germans, tribes to the north who, in Roman eyes, lived in mud, wore animal skins, and smeared butter on everything like savages. To a Roman, butter was something barbarians used as cooking grease or hair product, not something civilized people put in their mouths. Instead, Romans preferred olive oil, which was central to their cuisine. Olive oil was used for frying, baking, dressing vegetables, moisturizing skin, lighting lamps, and even cleaning the body at public baths. It was Rome's version of the all-purpose miracle ingredient. Butter, by comparison, was soft, fatty, and spoiled quickly in the heat. It didn't travel well, it didn't store well, and it had none of the cultural cachet that olive oil carried. So even when butter was available, most Romans turned up their noses and passed. This disdain wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a reflection of identity. The Roman diet, especially among the upper classes, was about self-image. Butter was rustic, oil was refined, cheese could be civilized in moderation. Milk was tolerated in certain contexts, usually warmed with honey or herbs, but rarely celebrated. No one gathered for wine and dairy boards. No one boasted about their buttery pastries. And while desserts did exist, most relied on honey, nuts, or dried fruit. If cheese appeared, it was usually as a topping or an afterthought. Even in medical texts, dairy was treated cautiously. Roman physicians like Galen wrote extensively about diet, and they frequently warned against too much milk or cheese, especially for those with weak stomachs or moist temperaments. Butter was occasionally recommended as a medicinal salve for wounds, burns, or skin irritation, but rarely as food. It's not that they didn't know how to use dairy, it's that they didn't really want to. So if you were in ancient Rome and craving something creamy and delicious, you had limited options. Cheese, dry, sour, and grainy. Milk, perishable and suspect. Butter, foreign and frowned upon. The best case scenario was a bit of fresh cheese crumbled onto your barley porridge. A texture upgrade, but not exactly a taste revolution. You'd eat it because it was there, because it filled a gap, and because it was better than nothing. But deep down, you'd dream of a world where butter melted over toast and milk came cold and sweet from a fridge. A world that hadn't been invented yet. If you lived in ancient Rome and didn't have the money for meat, which was often, your next best hope was vegetables. Not because they were delicious, but because they were relatively easy to grow, difficult to ruin completely, and far less likely to crawl away from your cooking pot. Vegetables were one of the few food groups available across every class. Whether you were a senator with a cook staff or a tenant crammed into an upper-level insula with a single clay bowl to your name, you ate greens. The difference was in how you got them, how fresh they were, and whether you cooked them until they wept. Romans had a broad word for vegetables and garden greens, olera. This referred to pretty much anything edible that sprouted from the ground and wasn't considered a luxury. It included cabbage, leeks, garlic, onions, beets, radishes, lentils, peas and turnips, the core components of many Roman meals. These were boiled, stewed or fried in olive oil, often alongside legumes or pulses. And while that may sound healthy enough by modern standards, Roman vegetable preparation wasn't exactly elegant. The goal wasn't to enhance texture or preserve nutrients. It was to make things soft, hot, and safe to eat, which often meant boiling them until they no longer had a will to live. Seasonal availability made things more difficult. Without refrigeration, cold storage, or a global shipping network, you ate what was ripe at the time, and only at that time. If it wasn't cabbage season, you weren't eating cabbage. If the market had leeks, great. If not, you were out of luck. Wealthy landowners might import or preserve certain vegetables using salt, vinegar, or oil, but the average person simply went without. Seasonal gaps were normal. You didn't complain about it. You just waited, chewed your barley, and stared longingly at someone else's onions. If you were lucky enough to have access to a hortus, a small household or community kitchen garden, you could grow your own alera. Even modest homes often made space for a few rows of greens, herbs or beans. The rich, of course, turned this into a performance. Elite villas boasted expansive horti with rare plants, imported seeds, and decorative fountains. For them, vegetables were less about feeding the family and more about demonstrating leisure time and land ownership. For you, a garden meant maybe getting a handful of edible leaves that hadn't yet been claimed by insects or goats. Legumes were particularly common, not only because they were easy to grow, but because they stored well and filled bellies cheaply. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans made frequent appearances in stews and porridges. They provided some protein and could survive the long haul from a field to kitchen without spoiling. Unfortunately, they also caused gas, a lot of it. Roman writers occasionally commented on the effects of beans, with the kind of passive-aggressive poetry usually reserved for bad emperors. But discomfort was a small price to pay for survival. When it came to fruit, things got slightly better, if you could afford the fresh stuff. Romans enjoyed a variety of fruits: figs, grapes, dates, apples, pears, plums, and quinces. But like vegetables, fresh fruit was seasonal and perishable, which meant most poor citizens rarely got it at its best. Instead, you ate it dried, pickled, or stewed into something resembling jam. A dried fig was a common snack. A fresh fig, still soft and warm from the sun, was a luxury. You didn't see that kind of bounty unless you worked for a wealthy household or happened to be standing under the right tree at the right time. Olives occupied their own special place in the Roman diet. Technically a fruit, they were eaten whole, crushed into paste, or more commonly, pressed into olive oil. Raw olives straight from the tree were inedible, bitter enough to make you regret ever being born. They had to be cured in brine or lye to become palatable, a process that took time and patience. Once cured, they became a staple, eaten with bread, tossed into vegetable stews, or served as appetizers at dinner parties. If you had nothing else to eat, you could usually find a few olives and a crust of bread to scrape through the day. The rich, of course, had better access to fruits and vegetables, and they made sure everyone knew it. They served imported dates from North Africa, fresh grapes from private vineyards, or elaborately prepared dishes like baked apples with honey and pine nuts. They had the luxury of turning produce into art. You had the luxury of maybe not dying from scurvy. Still, produce was one of the few areas of the Roman diet that could genuinely shine. When fresh and properly prepared, vegetables and fruits offered real flavour and variety, a bright spot in an otherwise beige food landscape. But for the average Roman, those moments were rare. More often than not, your greens were wilted, your fruit was half rotten, and your stew tasted like boiled sadness with a hint of vinegar. But it kept you going. It filled the gap between pulses and bread, added a faint whisper of nutrition, and gave you just enough energy to make it to the next meal, where if fortune smiled, you might find yourself boiling the same cabbage again. If you lived in ancient Rome and wanted a home-cooked meal, you first had to solve a few basic problems. First, you probably didn't have a kitchen. Second, you probably didn't have proper cookware. Third, your entire building was a fire hazard. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, no one had really figured out food safety yet. So preparing a meal wasn't just a matter of mixing ingredients. It was a daily gamble involving ash, smoke, melting cookware, and an optimistic disregard for bacteria. Unless you were wealthy, your home didn't come with a dedicated cooking space. If you lived in an insula, a crowded apartment block stacked high with the poor and working classes, your living space was small, poorly ventilated, and rarely included anything resembling a kitchen. Open flames inside these wooden structures were discouraged for obvious reasons, and yet somehow still common. Fires were frequent, deadly, and often started in exactly the kind of place where someone just wanted to boil a pot of lentils without burning the entire neighbourhood down. Instead of a kitchen, you might have a brazier, a small metal stand filled with coals that could be used for heating or basic cooking. You could boil some grain, heat up porridge, or maybe grill a bit of salted fish. But the heat was uneven, the smoke got everywhere, and the risk of tipping it over while stirring was very real. Some households used communal hearths or cooked on rooftops, balancing between convenience and catastrophe. Others gave up altogether and relied on street vendors, who at least had more stable setups and less flammable homes. The rich, of course, had options. A proper Roman villa came with a cuisine or kitchen, usually located at the back of the house and staffed by enslaved cooks. These kitchens were smoky, dark and often windowless, but they had more space and access to storage. A wealthy household might have multiple cooking stations, ovens, grinding tools, large pots and roasting spits. Some even had terracotta stoves or built-in fireboxes, but even these setups weren't what you'd call hygienic. Kitchens were often greasy, ash-covered and infested with flies. You didn't enter them for inspiration. You entered them because someone had to make the jellyfish stew. As for cookware, Romans used what they had, and what they had wasn't always safe. Bronze, copper and lead were common materials for pots, pans and utensils. Lead was especially favoured for its malleability and low melting point. It was used in mixing bowls, cooking pots, wine vessels, and even for sweetening food. Romans knew how to make lead-based sapa, a concentrated grape syrup boiled down in lead containers that added a pleasantly sweet taste to dishes, and possibly a few irreversible neurological issues. But the long-term health consequences weren't understood, or simply ignored. If a pot was shiny and got the job done, that was good enough. Ingredients were another area where Roman pragmatism clashed with modern sensibilities. Recipes from the period, like those in the cookbook attributed to Apicius, call for combinations of ingredients that sound more like dares than meals. Fish sauce mixed with honey, vinegar poured over fruit, ash used as a seasoning or thickener. That's right, ash, sometimes added intentionally for flavour, other times accidentally mixed in from dirty ovens or hearths. In either case, your food often came with a hint of charcoal, whether you wanted it or not. Hygiene as a concept was optional at best. There were no gloves, no hand-washing protocols, and certainly no separate cutting boards for meat and vegetables. Food was prepared on wooden surfaces, stone slabs, or simply in bowls that had been used dozens of times without ever seeing soap. Romans didn't lack running water. In fact, their aqueduct systems were impressive, but the connection between cleanliness and disease wasn't fully formed. A clean kitchen was one where you could see most of the floor. That was about it. Preservation methods weren't much better. Without refrigeration, food spoiled fast, meat was salted, dried or pickled. Fish was fermented into sauces or smoked if possible. Fruits were preserved in honey or vinegar, but fresh ingredients had a shelf life of hours, not days. You had to shop daily, cook quickly, and hope that what you bought hadn't already turned. In warm months, that was more of a wish than a plan. And then there was the smoke. Roman cooking produced an impressive amount of it. Without chimneys or proper ventilation, smoke simply collected in homes or kitchens, staining walls and filling lungs. Cooks worked in choking conditions, their eyes watering and robes absorbing the scent of burning oil and charred vegetables. If your food didn't come out blackened on the bottom, you probably weren't trying hard enough. So no, cooking in ancient Rome wasn't a comforting ritual. It was a chore, a risk, and a reminder that even simple things could go wrong in 3 or 4 different ways. If you had time, equipment, and a bit of skill, you could pull off a decent stew or porridge. If not, you might settle for something vaguely warm and edible. Or you'd head to the street stalls, let someone else take the risk, and pray your intestines could survive the outcome. If you found yourself thirsty in ancient Rome, the first and most important rule was simple: don't drink the water. Not unless you wanted to spend the next several days regretting every life choice that led you to a Roman aqueduct with an unfiltered cup. While the Romans were famously skilled engineers, they built miles of aqueducts, fountains, and public baths. The concept of safe drinking water had not quite reached modern standards. The same system that brought water into your home could also be used for communal bathing, waste disposal, and the occasional fish tank. Cross-contamination was inevitable, and boiling water before drinking it was more of a suggestion than a habit. So instead, you drank wine, a lot of wine. But don't imagine fine vintages swirled in glass goblets. Vinum, the Roman word for wine, was rarely consumed in its pure form. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as rude, foolish, or even barbaric. Only drunks and uncivilized tribes drank wine straight from the amphora. A proper Roman diluted their wine with water, sometimes as much as 1 part wine to 3 parts water, creating a beverage that was safer than untreated water but still carried enough alcohol to keep the intestinal parasites guessing. The result wasn't particularly tasty, but it was Roman tradition. Even children drank it. There was no juice, no soda, and definitely no milk. Just weak wine, and the vague hope that it wouldn't ferment further in your stomach. For those who wanted a little more excitement, there was posca, the working class drink of choice. Posca was a mix of vinegar and water, sometimes with herbs or old wine added in for flavour. It was tart, acidic, and refreshing if you were dehydrated and had no better options. Soldiers drank it, labourers drank it, and anyone who couldn't afford decent wine drank it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. The vinegar content helped kill bacteria, and it was often easier on the stomach than whatever sludge passed for water in your part of town. It also travelled well and didn't spoil easily, making it a favourite on military campaigns. Posca was, in many ways, the Roman electrolyte drink, if electrolytes burned your throat and reminded you of floor cleaner. If you had a bit more money and a taste for sweetness, you might enjoy mulsum, wine mixed with honey. Unlike posca, which was designed to be practical, mulsum was meant to be pleasant. It was served chilled if possible, and often brought out during banquets or as an appetizer drink. It softened the natural acidity of Roman wine and gave it a dessert-like quality. Of course, since refrigeration didn't exist, chilled usually meant buried in a cool corner of the house and hoped for the best. Still, for those who could afford it, mulsum added a touch of luxury to an otherwise sharp and vinegary drinking landscape. Another variation was acetum, a vinegar made from spoiled wine. While you wouldn't usually drink acetum on its own, it was often used as a base for sauces, a preservative, or even as a medical treatment. Romans believed it had cleansing properties, both internally and externally. It showed up in cooking, cleaning, and even battlefield medicine. And if someone handed you a cup of acetum by mistake, you'd probably choke politely and pretend you enjoyed it, because rejecting a host's offering wasn't always worth the social consequences. What you didn't find much of, at least not for drinking, was plain water. While some urban fountains and public cisterns provided relatively clean supplies, most Romans avoided drinking unaltered water when they could. It was used for bathing, cooking, or washing, but rarely for quenching thirst, unless you were very poor or very desperate. Even then, you'd usually try to mix it with something else: wine, vinegar, or herbs. The taste of water alone, especially after sitting in clay storage vessels for hours, was often enough to make you reconsider thirst as a concept. Elite Romans, of course, took all this to the next level. They flavoured their diluted wine with seawater, herbs, or flower extracts. Some recipes called for infusions of rose petals, myrrh, or even resin. Others suggested warming wine with pepper or diluting it with snow, if you could get it. These weren't flavour improvements so much as social statements. You didn't drink seawater wine because it tasted good. You drank it because it showed that you could afford to ruin wine with imported salt and still keep sipping. So whether you were relaxing after a long day in the fields or reclining at a noble feast, drinking in Rome was less about pleasure and more about chemistry, class, and intestinal survival. You drank wine because water was risky. You drank Posca because wine was too expensive. You drank Mulsum when you wanted to feel fancy. And you diluted everything because that was the rule. And if none of it went well, if the vinegar burned or the wine spoiled or the water betrayed you, well, you just reminded yourself that sobriety was for barbarians anyway. If you were poor, overworked, and too tired to light a fire in your cramped Roman apartment, which described most people most of the time, you probably ate from the streets. Not off the streets, mind you, though that wasn't entirely out of the question. No, you went to the popinae, the ancient Roman answer to fast food. These were small taverns or food stalls scattered throughout the city, usually built into the walls of buildings or tucked between crumbling alleyways. They served hot meals, cheap wine, and whatever could be ladled into a bowl and eaten quickly with minimal chewing and maximum regret. The popinae were everywhere. You couldn't walk down a busy Roman street without smelling something sizzling in oil, something stewing over a low flame, or something vaguely edible being held out by a vendor shouting aggressively in Latin. These stalls catered almost exclusively to the working class: builders, labourers, slaves, and anyone who couldn't afford the luxury of time, space, or ingredients to cook at home. If you lived in an insula, you probably didn't have a kitchen anyway. And even if you did, starting a fire in a wooden apartment block wasn't exactly the smartest move. So you ate out every day. The more respectable version of the popina was the thermopolium, which looked a bit like a modern lunch counter, except instead of a refrigerator display case and clean surfaces, you got big clay jars, called dolia, sunk into a stone counter, each filled with something hot, salty, and probably a little suspicious. Thermopolia were usually L-shaped, open to the street, and had a counter where you could lean in, hand over a coin, and receive a scoop of food that might or might not contain what the sign promised, assuming there even was a sign. So what did you actually eat at one of these places? That depended on your luck, your budget, and your tolerance for gastrointestinal risk. Fried fish was popular. Small, whole fish, breaded and tossed in oil until golden, or at least brownish. You ate them bones and all with your fingers, while trying not to think about the oil's age, or its last 3 uses. There were also stews, thick, salty mixtures of lentils, vegetables, bits of sausage, and whatever else the cook could scavenge that morning. Some included meat, or something that had once resembled meat, chopped finely enough that no one could ask too many questions. Baked goods were another staple. Vendors sold small loaves of bread, pastries filled with dates or honey, and savoury items like cheese pies or stuffed rolls. Of course, the crust might be tough, the filling might be scant, and the nutritional value might hover somewhere between styrofoam and regret, but they were cheap, hot, and vaguely food-shaped. You could also get sausages like lucanica, spiced and greasy and curled into coils like edible rope. They were often grilled in plain sight, a smart move, since watching the sausage cook gave you a rare chance to confirm that it had, in fact, been cooked. Wine was also on the menu. Most popinae doubled as drinking spots, with cheap vinum available by the cup. It was usually watered down, sour, and served warm, but it kept your mouth busy and your stomach too distracted to notice the stew's aftertaste. If you had more than a few cups, the food even started to taste good. Or at least, less bad. Hygiene was optional. Food sat out for hours in open jars, uncovered and unrefrigerated, with flies drifting lazily over the surface. Cooks stirred with wooden spoons, their aprons stained, and their hands questionably clean. The counters were rarely scrubbed, and leftover food was often repurposed into the next day's special. If the stew started to sour, you added more vinegar. If the meat looked questionable, you chopped it smaller. The goal wasn't safety, it was plausible deniability. Still, the popinai served an essential purpose. They fed the masses. For many Romans, this was their only hot meal of the day. It was fast, affordable, and social. You could catch up on gossip, hear the latest news, or complain about taxes while elbow deep in fried anchovies. If you were lucky, the food didn't make you sick. If you weren't, well, the baths were close by and you knew the drill. Of course, not everyone loved the popinai. Roman elites saw them as seedy, low-class establishments, frequented by gamblers, drunks and ne'er-do-wells. Philosophers warned that street food weakened the mind. Politicians feared them as breeding grounds for unrest. But none of that stopped people from lining up for a bowl of steaming lentil stew when the sun dipped low and the smell of fried dough drifted through the streets. So you went. You bought what you could afford. You ate it standing up, one eye on the stew and one eye on your surroundings. And you hoped your meal wouldn't fight back later. Because in Rome, convenience came with consequences. And street food was always a bit of a dare served in a clay bowl. If you were a Roman citizen, specifically a male citizen living in the city of Rome, there was at least one small perk to go along with the taxes, overcrowding, and near constant threat of sewer overflow. You were eligible for the Annona, Rome state-sponsored grain distribution system. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't generous, but it was just enough to keep you alive, and, more importantly to the ruling class, just pacified enough not to riot. The Annona began as a practical solution to a political problem. Rome, even at its height, couldn't feed itself. The city was too big, too dense, and too far removed from reliable farmland. So grain had to be imported, mostly from Sicily and Egypt, where the Nile's predictable floods created one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. Each year, massive fleets of grain ships left Alexandria, bound for Rome, their holds packed with wheat destined to become coarse loaves, thin porridge, and weary size. This supply chain, known as the Cura Annani, was one of the most important logistical operations in the empire. Administered by state officials, the system organized collection, storage, transportation, and distribution of grain on a scale that rivaled modern bureaucracies. At its peak, over 200,000 Roman citizens were enrolled to receive regular grain rations, either free or at steeply discounted prices. This wasn't charity, this was crowd control. You see, hunger in Rome wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a political liability. When the grain ran out, people didn't just grumble, they burned things. The Senate had learned this lesson early. A hungry mob was a dangerous mob, and no one in power wanted to be the one responsible for cutting the grain dole. So instead of letting the city go hungry, emperors funneled enormous resources into making sure the Annona functioned, or at least functioned well enough to delay the inevitable. As a recipient, your experience was simple. You stood in line, sometimes for hours, at one of the designated horea, or grain warehouses. You presented your eligibility token, known as a tessera, and received your allotment. It wasn't much. A monthly ration might be enough to feed you. Barely, if you were frugal and supplemented it with whatever else you could afford, or scavenge. The grain wasn't always fresh. It wasn't always clean. Sometimes it was full of husks, bugs, or dust. But it was there, and it was free. That was enough. Of course, this setup had its flaws, most of them involving ships, weather, and human nature. Rome's reliance on imported grain made it vulnerable. If the Nile floods were weak one year, yields dropped. If storms hit the Mediterranean, grain fleets were delayed or lost. If pirates decided to make a comeback, which they often did, convoys had to be rerouted or escorted. Any disruption in the supply chain meant panic in the city. It didn't take long for rumours to spread. Grain prices would spike, merchants would hoard supplies, and you'd be right back in line at the bakery, praying that today's loaf hadn't been baked with sawdust and chalk. When grain ran short, bread riots followed. The people of Rome were not shy about expressing their discontent. They rioted in forums, looted storehouses, and occasionally chased politicians through the streets. Even emperors weren't immune. Augustus, the great stabilizer, once had to scramble to buy grain out of pocket when shipments stalled. Claudius faced near revolt when a particularly bad shortage hit. Nero had to deal with famine-related unrest on multiple occasions. Not that he was particularly helpful. One of his proposed solutions involved a dramatic display of concern while blaming absolutely everyone else. To prevent these disasters, grain shipments became a matter of national security. The Egyptian grain fleets, massive convoys protected by the Imperial Navy, were tracked and timed with military precision. Delays were monitored, deliveries were logged. Governors who failed to deliver were reprimanded, replaced, or occasionally executed. Egypt itself was placed under direct imperial control, partly to ensure a steady grain supply. Keeping the people of Rome fed wasn't just good governance, it was survival. Still, the annona had a profound effect on Roman society. It created a population increasingly dependent on the state for sustenance. It distorted urban demographics, drawing poor citizens to the capital in hopes of free food. It created opportunities for corruption, manipulation, and fraud. And it allowed emperors to play the role of provider, using bread, and often circuses in the form of public games, to maintain loyalty and distract from the smell of rot wafting through the alleyways. So if you lived in Rome and were lucky enough to be on the grain rolls, you ate, maybe not well, but consistently. If not, you begged, stole, or bartered your way into someone else's surplus. And if the ships didn't come, you stood in a growing crowd staring down an empty market stall, knowing full well that tomorrow's headline might be you, throwing a broken amphora at a city magistrate in front of a cheering mob. Because in ancient Rome, the line between dinner and disaster was often just one late shipment away. If you were poor in ancient Rome, you knew exactly what your meals would look like. Grain, pulses, maybe a pickled olive, and a whole lot of repetition. If you were rich, your meals were elaborate, strange, and sometimes deadly. But if you're wondering who had it worse, the underfed or the overfed, the answer isn't as simple as you might think. Because when it came to Roman cuisine, everyone lost, just in different and creatively miserable ways. Let's start with the poor. Your meals, as you know by now, were built on survival. You ate what you could afford, which often meant pulse, that delightful mixture of boiled grain and resignation, along with coarse bread full of grit, and the occasional bean stew that doubled as a digestive dare. If meat showed up, it was likely sacrificed leftovers or mystery bits disguised in stew. If cheese appeared, it was sour and crumbly. If fruit came your way, it was dried or overripe. You weren't eating for pleasure. You were eating so you didn't collapse on your way to work. Starvation was always just a missed shipment or failed harvest away. And even when food was available, it wasn't always safe. Spoilage was common. Preservation was limited. Parasites, mold, and questionable sanitation were part of the daily experience. But at least there was no pretense. You knew your food was terrible. You just hoped it wouldn't kill you. Now, if you were rich, your experience was different, but not necessarily better. You didn't eat because you were hungry. You ate because it was expected. Feasting was part of social life, part of politics, part of performance. And the more bizarre your food choices, the more status you signalled. Flamingo tongues? Impressive. Cow udders stuffed with sea urchin? Even better. Everything had to be exotic, elaborate, and aggressively inedible. You weren't feeding your body. You were feeding your image. And you didn't just eat, you gorged. Roman elite banquets often consisted of multiple courses, sometimes more than a dozen, with each one stranger than the last. You'd recline on your couch while enslaved cooks and servers paraded dishes across the room. You'd sip wine mixed with honey and seawater. You'd sprinkle your jellyfish with fermented fish sauce. And when you couldn't eat anymore, you'd excuse yourself or be discreetly handed a bucket so you could purge and make room for more. Which brings us to the vomitorium, a term often misunderstood. Contrary to popular myth, a vomitorium was not a designated room for vomiting during feasts. The word actually referred to an architectural feature, a passageway that allowed crowds to spew out of amphitheatres quickly. But the myth persists because, frankly, it sounds plausible. The wealthy did sometimes vomit mid-banquet, especially during long feasts. It wasn't ritualised or organised, but it happened. After all, how else were you supposed to get through 14 courses of stuffed dormice, honey-glazed locusts, and boiled sow's womb? Gluttony in Rome wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated, at least among the upper classes. Being able to overeat meant you had wealth, access, and status. You weren't bound by necessity. You could afford waste, but the consequences were real. Parasites thrived in undercooked or poorly preserved food. Wealthy Romans often suffered from chronic stomach ailments, gout from overeating rich foods, and a wide array of mysterious digestive disorders that were probably not so mysterious in hindsight. The poor starved, but the rich often ate themselves sick. And in the middle of it all sat the working class, people who weren't destitute but weren't well off either. Their meals were reliable but monotonous. Bread, beans, vegetables, occasionally a bit of meat or cheese if they were lucky. They cooked at home when they could, bought food from Popeni when they couldn't, and tried to avoid both starvation and food poisoning in equal measure. They didn't suffer the spectacle of elite cuisine or the absolute misery of poverty. Instead, they endured a steady, flavourless slog of nutrition without joy. So who had it worse? It depends on what you value. The poor lived with hunger and uncertainty, with meals that barely sustained and never delighted. The rich lived in a world of excess, where food was more about politics than pleasure, and every bite came with a side of parasites. The working class had stability, but at the cost of variety, and everyone, regardless of class, had to deal with the same spoiled ingredients, questionable preservation methods, and total lack of food safety standards. It's tempting to assume the rich won this one. They had more after all, but more doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means more ways to ruin dinner. The poor may have gone hungry, but at least they weren't being force-fed oysters stuffed with lark tongues under the judging eyes of their peers. In the end, Roman food wasn't a reward. It was a reflection of status, economics, and survival instincts. And whether you were scraping burnt porridge from a communal pot or daintily spitting out an overcooked sea cucumber, you weren't eating to thrive, you were eating to endure. Rome was a civilization of contradictions. It built aqueducts that flowed for miles, engineered concrete structures that still stand today, and ruled an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. It created roads so reliable that some are still in use, developed legal systems, military tactics, and urban planning techniques that influenced the world for centuries. But when it came to dinner, it never really figured that part out. Food in ancient Rome was not about comfort or enjoyment. It was about survival, status, or spectacle, depending on who you were. If you were poor, you ate to survive. Whatever grain, legumes, or scraps you could afford or beg for. You boiled porridge, soaked crusts of stale bread in sour wine, and hoped the stew didn't bite back. There was no choice, no indulgence, and very little variation. Hunger was familiar, fullness was suspicious, and every meal came with the background knowledge that a bad harvest or a delayed grain shipment could turn your dinner into nothing at all. If you were rich, you didn't worry about famine, but you also didn't eat for satisfaction. You ate for the audience. Dishes were crafted not to please the tongue, but to impress the guests, to signal your wealth and refinement. You served courses that combined ingredients no one asked for. Jellyfish, sow's womb, dormice, and seafood drowned in garum. You vomited between courses, reclined dramatically on couches, and performed your meal like theatre. There was no comfort, only pageantry. And while you had more variety, more wine, and more servants to prepare it all, you also had parasites, indigestion, and an unfortunate tendency to season everything with lead and social anxiety. In between the extremes sat the average Roman, a small landowner, a shopkeeper, a soldier, whose diet was consistent but uninspiring. Bread, beans, barley, cabbage. Again, maybe some cheese if things went well, maybe a fig if it was the right season, maybe a scrap of meat if a holiday brought a public sacrifice. But for the most part, your food was beige, boiled, and nutritionally just enough to keep you upright. You didn't starve, but you didn't thrive either. You just ate what was available, avoided what looked suspicious, and hoped your guts were stronger than your neighbours. And none of this even touches on the actual infrastructure. The city of Rome, even at its height, could barely feed itself. It relied on a sprawling, fragile supply chain. Grain from Egypt, olives from Spain, wine from Gaul, all transported by ship, cart and bureaucratic optimism. The annona, Rome's grain dole, existed not because of charity, but because the alternative was riots. And those riots happened anyway. Sometimes just because a ship was late, or a crop failed on the wrong side of the Mediterranean. Food distribution in Rome was not a solved problem. It was a constant crisis in slow motion. Even the street food, those bustling Popeni and Thermopolia that kept the lower classes fed, came with risks. Meals were cheap, but often unsafe. Ingredients sat in jars for hours, open to the elements. Meat was reused, stew was stretched, and the line between edible and experimental blurred more with each passing day. But you still ate it, because you had no time or space to cook at home, and you hoped that one bowl of lentils might hold off hunger until tomorrow. And when you look at the whole picture, the grand feasts that doubled as theatre, the government-subsidised porridge lines, the elite banquets flavoured with fermented fish guts and guilt, a pattern emerges. Rome didn't view food as nourishment, it viewed it as symbol. For the poor, it symbolised the empire's neglect. For the rich, it symbolised dominance, excess and cultural superiority, even if it made them sick. And for the empire as a whole, it symbolised a problem no amount of conquest could truly solve. Because despite everything Rome built, everything it conquered, and everything it claimed, it never quite conquered hunger. Its citizens were fed, barely, poorly, extravagantly, or inconsistently. But they were rarely satisfied. Food was rarely a joy. It was a duty, a weapon, a political tool. It kept the empire going, but it never gave it peace. So yes, Rome built roads, ruled nations, and dreamed of immortality. But when it came time to sit down and eat, all those dreams were filtered through a bowl of gruel, a hunk of questionable bread, or a silver plate of peacock drenched in fish sauce. The empire endured for centuries. Its food mercifully did not. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, full of modern meals and free of fish guts, you can rest easy, knowing that however bad your cooking might be, at least you didn't have to boil it in lead or season it with vinegar and sand.